Evaluating visual evidence is a complex process with a lot of potential failure points. And this whole process only gets messier when influential or powerful people inject themselves into the mix and start telling you what it is you're seeing. Dan Cahan conducted another study in which participants were shown footage of a turbulent street protest disrupting an unidentified business. The footage was altered to make it impossible to read the text that was on the protester signs. In the footage, a pedestrian is seen approaching the business but turning away due to the protesters blocking the sidewalk. One group of study participants was told that the business in question was an abortion clinic and the person who turned away was a patient. Another was told that it was a military recruitment center and that the person who turned away was a student. At this point, it should come as no surprise to you that the participants' reaction was based on their cultural and political beliefs. But the thing is, they had no real evidence to go on other than what they had been told. They reacted to what they were told they were seeing, not to what they were actually seeing. And we've seen this effect in the real world. During the 2025 Los Angeles wildfires, a video purportedly showing widespread looting in the city went viral. But there was a problem. The people shown in the video weren't looting, they were evacuating their own home. That didn't stop the false claims of looting from spreading far and wide, based only on what people were told the video was showing. This is problematic, obviously. No one puts a video up on the internet without first telling you what it is you're supposed to be seeing, and maybe they've given it a cool rage-baity headline and a nice thumbnail. Not that I would ever do that. So what happens is that we start forming impressions about what we see before we even see it. We're also not terribly good at recalling what we've seen. In yet another study, 2,000 participants were shown a video of a purse snatching and then asked to pick the culprit out of a police lineup. 75% of them picked the wrong person. And many of them later admitted that they couldn't remember what the culprit looked like at all, but they felt pressured by the police lineup setting to just pick someone anyway. Studies like this and the cases that I mentioned above have some experts in the law enforcement community starting to question the value of eyewitness testimony and suggesting that we stop treating it as the gold standard of evidence.